Hi there, everybody. My name is Dr. Mark Griffiths. I'm Distinguished Professor of Behavioural Addiction at Nottingham Trent University, and I'm also the Director of the International Gaming Research Unit there. I think this is the 5th year running that I presented at this particular conference, so I'd like to thank Kindred and Maris particularly for the invite. And today I'm going to do what I've called more of a personal overview, looking at how academics can work collaboratively with the gambling industry. And what I want to do during my presentation, I just want to briefly talk about how I've actually personally worked with the gambling industry throughout my career. I want to talk about how research that's funded by the gambling industry can be perceived by others, either by other academics or other stakeholders. But more importantly, what I'm going to spend the majority of the time looking at is how I believe technological innovation within the gambling industry has actually moved the field of responsible gambling forward over the last few years. And as I say, on the right of the screen there, you won't be able to see this properly, but there's 2 articles I wrote back 15 years ago trying to talk about the benefits of academics working with the gambling industry for lots and lots of different reasons. And I'm going to be talking about some of those today. So in terms of me, well, I've spent 33 years in the field of gambling studies. I started back in 1987 working on a PhD on slot machine addiction. Obviously, you know, my kind of focus on gambling has been to do with problem gambling. And there has often been a perception that if you work on problem gambling, you must somehow be anti-gambling. And that's not true at all of me. I'm a gambler myself. I'd be a hypocrite to be anti-gambling. But anyway, even though I work, as I say, in problem gambling, my friends who work in the field of things like alcohol use disorder, they're not accused of being anti-drinking, but I've often had it leveled against me that I must be anti-gambling because I work on problem gambling. But as I say, that couldn't be further from the truth. Back in 1997, I co-founded an organisation called GamCare, which runs the National Telephone Helpline Service in the UK. And I suppose that was my first real workings with the gambling industry, because GamCare at that particular time, the way that we were funded was through voluntary donations from the gambling industry. And that's when I had to do a lot of liaising with people in the gambling industry, because I was the chair of the trustees of GamCare at that time. A year later in 1998, that's when I did my very first consultancy for a gambling industry operator. That was with a company called Interlotto. And I've now acted as a consultant for over 30 different gambling operators all over the world. I'm also somebody that's often perceived as, oh, all my research is funded by the industry. I mean, for the record, out of my over 1,000 refereed scientific papers that I've published, only 16 of those papers have been what I would describe as indirectly or directly funded by the industry. My first paper that was indirectly funded by Svenska Spel was back in 2009. I then had a second paper in 2014 that was indirectly funded by Camelot. And then I've had another 14 papers over the last 3 years that have primarily been funded either by Norsk Tipping or by Kindred. Now, you know, one of the things that's become quite obvious to me is that as soon as you have any association with the gambling industry as an academic, that immediately attracts detractors. Here on the screen now, these are some of the kind of things that people have said about me on Twitter. I've just chosen a few tweets here from an organisation called the Campaign for Fairer Gambling, who said, the first tweet there said there, for those who don't know Dr. Mark Griffiths, he is an industry-funded defender of fixed odds betting terminals, a supposed academic who does what the industry tells him. Another one at the bottom, you know, was talking about Dr. Mark Griffiths doing more dirty work for the British Association for Bookmakers. I mean, these kind of things that are levelled at me, I mean, they've become water off a duck's back to me now. I know that there are people who are academics, there are people who work for various organisations who will just say that it's totally immoral for me to be working with the industry. And in fact, a lot of those people that are my detractors will say I'm working for the industry, which is not, you know, that's absolute rubbish. I work with the industry. And one of the reasons I've worked with the industry is because, you know, at the heart of the things is that we've both got the same kind of moral philosophy, which is to protect players and to minimise harm for those who are who actually engage in gambling. So in terms of what my own position is with collaborating with the gambling industry, well, that's out there in the public domain. back in 2015, myself and Michael Auer, who I've done a lot of work with in terms of our kind of behavioural tracking studies and using data provided by the gambling industry, we published a paper so that we made it very clear what we do and what we don't do in terms of our work with the gambling industry. And in that paper, we tried to talk about the differences, for instance, between doing research for the gambling industry and doing consultancy with the gambling industry. And one of the things that underpins research is that anybody who does research with the gambling industry should be free and to independently publish whatever they find, irrespective of whether the funder likes it or not. Whereas consultancy tends to be something that is controlled by the industry. They can use the findings of your consultancy to disseminate in any way that they want to. That the intellectual property rights actually rest with the gambling industry in that particular situation. I think there are lots, that this paper also outlined the benefits of researchers working collaboratively with the gambling industry. And one of the things that, from my perspective is the best thing is that there is high quality data and you have a confirmed presence that these are real gamblers, rather than, for instance, doing experiments with psychology undergraduates in a laboratory situation. I also think that there's a tension between what I would call an ideal world philosophy and a real world pragmatism when it comes to the funding of gambling research. We had a situation going way back to the early 2000s where Tony Blair, at the time, who was prime minister in the country, basically had a philosophy of what he called polluter pays. And when that was applied to the gambling industry, it was basically saying is that we as a government will not fund gambling research. And since gambling companies have lots and lots of money, they should be putting forward the money for research in those situations. And the other thing I made a point in that paper is I think a lot of people think that if you're funded by the industry, then the industry somehow kind of dictates what you're going to say, what you're going to publish. And I'm very lucky in the sense that I've worked for many different funders, including governments, including charities, and including the gambling industry. And I can tell you now from my own personal experience, actually government-funded research, which often tends to be seen as the kind of best type of research in lots of different circles, I've had more restrictions placed on me about what I can and can't publish and what I can say and can't say to the media than I've ever had from any kind of gambling industry funded research. And again, with the research I've done for charities, you would think that charities would just let you sit and try and independently publish your research. But again, the amount of control that the funders have had personally in my situations, I found that far more difficult than the few studies that I've actually had funded by the gambling industry. Another thing I think is very important when it comes to publishing your research. I mean, obviously, I always declare my conflicts of interest, my declarations of who the research is being funded by. I think one of the things I personally would point out is that I think your own personal ideology actually has far more of a bearing on gambling research than who the funder is. So, for instance, depending on whether you personally have got an anti-gambling attitude, a gambling neutral attitude, or you're pro-gambling, that will dictate, for instance, how you write up the things that you find from your research. So I've just put a little example here to kind of illustrate this. Here in the UK, we've got a problem gambling rate of around about 0.5%. Okay, and that's based on the most recent studies. But depending on what your personal ideology is, whether you're anti-gambling or pro-gambling, how you report that finding could actually be reported in lots of different ways. So, for instance, you could say, if you're very pro-gambling, you might want to say the overwhelming majority of the sample surveyed, 99.5%, had no gambling problem. You might want to say something that kind of minimizes things, and you use a word like only. So only a tiny minority of the sample surveyed, 0.5%, had a gambling problem. Then you can get how I would probably write things in a more neutral way. I would probably say something like 0.5% of the sample surveyed had a gambling problem. Other people might put 99.5% of the sample surveyed had no gambling problems. And then finally, we've got one at the bottom, which again, I would probably say comes from more kind of, and I've seen this in journals, from a more anti-gambling stance, is that they then use what is a very small figure, 0.5%, but to try and make the figure look really horrendous is they then extrapolate to the whole population, and they say, say findings from the survey indicate that approximately 500,000 adults have a gambling problem. So, the thing is, when you write research, to me, sometimes it becomes quite obvious what a person's personal ideology is. And, this has nothing to do with the funding, but I do think this personal ideology, for me, actually dictates more how people publish research. Now, one of the things, from my perspective, is that, I argue this passionately now with my own research, is that there are many innovative studies that have now been published, particularly over the last 5 years, that just simply couldn't have happened without gambling industry cooperation. And as I say, one of the things that I love about working with the industry is that it has the best high quality data that I've ever come across before in my 33 years. And, so what I was just going to do here now is just talk about some of the kind of examples of, what I consider to be innovative practice and, the things that are taking the field of responsibility gambling forward by actually working with the industry. So, for instance, myself and Michael Auer, we've done a whole series of studies now looking at the efficacy of limit setting, whether that's, the setting of time limits, the setting of money limits, whether it's deposit limits, whether it's global loss limits. So many different companies that we've worked with, going right back to 2012 here, our first ever study on the efficacy of a responsible gambling tool looked at limit setting. And what we found in that study was that, gamblers who set limits, voluntary limits, actually, particularly amongst the most gambling intense players, actually did reduce their spend quite significantly. And we also found that it differentiated by group. We found that, for instance, poker players who set time limits on their gambling spent far less money, whereas casino and lottery gamblers, if they set financial monetary limits, they were more protected in terms of the amount of money that they spent. We've also done some limit setting studies. We've done published a couple recently with Kindred Gaming. And one of the most interesting findings that we found from the data that they supplied to us is that people who set voluntary limits on their gambling behavior, they seem to be more loyal to the company. And if companies are really concerned about long-term repeat business and about lifetime customer retention, then our research would tend to indicate is that the more that you're using these responsible gambling tools like limit setting features, you're more likely to stay with that particular individual company. So as I say, limit setting, there have been other researchers and there are other companies, in fact, who have said limit setting doesn't really work. However, we've done a whole series of studies now. And, although we would admit that limit setting doesn't work for absolutely everybody, it does seem to be that, the benefits of using limit setting far outweigh any of the disadvantages. Another area where myself and Michael Auer have done research is looking at the efficacy of pop-up messaging. I mean, one of the reasons we went into this area is that there were 5 or 6 studies, particularly published in Canada and in Australia, all done in an experimental situation, usually with psychology undergraduates or university undergraduates, where, for instance, people played a slot machine in an experimental laboratory situation, and during that they were shown a pop-up message encouraging them to stop playing. And nearly all of those studies basically came to the conclusion that by providing a pop-up message, gamblers will stop when they read it. However, Michael and myself, we actually did a couple of studies. Our first study had 50,000 online gamblers. The second study had 70,000 online gamblers. And what we basically found is for those gamblers who were playing very intensively, and by intensively here, we measured it by the number of people who played 1,000 consecutive slot games in a row. What we found was that when those people got a message saying that they played 1,000 slot machine games consecutively, the message actually only allowed for about 0.5% of people to actually stopped when they saw that message. We then did another study where we redesigned the message using psychological theories. And by doing that, we actually managed to double the amount of people who stopped playing when they saw that message. but it was still less than 1.5% of players that did that. So this is one of the real reasons we think that working with the industry, using real gamblers on real sites in real time has great benefit, because you can actually see what these interventions actually do for your players rather than what happens in a laboratory situation. And those laboratory studies that I just said, I think the biggest sample size out of any of those studies was 72 people. But anyway, so when we're talking about that we've got tens of thousands of real gamblers on a real gambling site, we think these studies have far more ecological validity. Another area that Michael Auer and myself have worked on over the past few years is looking at personalized feedback, and is actually giving players feedback about their actual gambling behavior, and to see whether by seeing that information and for them to self-appraise their own behavior, they actually change that behavior as a result. And as I say, in all of our studies, we've basically found that by giving personalized behavioral feedback to gamblers, that is bespoke information that is about their actual real gambling behavior that they do on that site, that does seem to reduce the amount of time and money they spend gambling. So again, we think this is another example of, without actually working with the industry, we would never have found out some of, these really key findings. And, obviously these, what's been very lucky for us is that we've had gambling operators who have actually allowed us to actually carry out real life experiments that actually could affect their bottom line while these experiments are taking place. But these have been done for the greater good, so that we know what kind of responsible gambling tools are the most effective. And there are a few other things that I think we've done in our research, which I think have been very helpful to not just to the gambling industry, but are helpful for people like policymakers and regulators, and obviously for other researchers and service treatment providers. Is some of the things that we can do by working with the industry is by using the large data sets that get given to us, we can start to do things like develop algorithms for predicting problem gambling, for predicting who might use a particular responsible gambling tool in the first place. The two examples I've got on my screen now, one of these, was working with Leo Vegas. Another one was working with Norsk Tipping. What we were able to do here is actually, because we've just got such large data sets here that are being provided voluntarily by the industry, because they genuinely want to know which people are more likely to use responsible gambling tools, which people are more likely to be developing problems. And of course, having these data sets, which of course are instant longitudinal data sets, this is really helping move the field of responsible gambling forward. A few other things that I think other innovative uses of gambling operator data. One of the things that I'm very pleased about is being able to use online tracking data and then compare it with what people say subjectively about their gambling. So, for instance, we did a study where we looked at what people said they thought they'd spent on gambling over a particular period, and then we actually matched that up with their real behavioral tracking data. And obviously, that I don't think the findings would shock anybody, but basically what we found is that if you are a very low time gambler, for instance, somebody who just buys a lottery ticket or two a week, you are very accurate in terms of being able to say how much you'd spent on gambling in a particular time period. But for those gamblers that were very regular gamblers, gambling more than a few times a week, and particularly on online casino games, is that these players, had no idea how much they were spending and were vastly underestimating how much they were actually spending on their gambling activity. We've also used, gambling data to test psychological theories. There is a theory called cognitive dissonance, where if what you're doing, there's a mismatch between what you're thinking and what you're doing, that causes tension. And we found that we could actually test this idea of cognitive dissonance using gamblers' real data and what they thought, and using that to change their player behavior. And one of the most recent studies we did with a data set is looking at the impact, for instance, that COVID-19 has had on sports betting behavior. Obviously for a couple of months there was a situation around the world that there were so few sporting events taking place that sports bettors had basically very little to gamble on whatsoever. So we looked at a particular gambling operator's data during that period, mainly to have a look at whether sports gamblers or sports bettors who were unable to engage in their favorite form of gambling displaced their behavior and actually went and gambled on something else instead, for instance, online casinos, what we found was that that wasn't the case at all. There was just a massive drop off in terms of people actually just gambling on the site in the first place. And even amongst sports bettors who were also regular online casino gamblers, they themselves also decreased the amount of online casino gambling they were doing, probably because they weren't coming to the betting site to start with, because there were no activities to gamble on in the first place. So two other ways that I would say that we've used industry data, which I think are highly innovative, and this has been used in Norway, is because in Norway, as in places like Sweden as well, they use a player card, and you cannot gamble in anywhere without using your player card, both online and offline. So even if you just buy a lottery ticket in a store in Norway, you still have to hand over your player card. Well, one of the great things about that player card, not only is it like an online gambling site in the sense that it collects every single action that you do related to your gambling, is that card also will help you in terms of the operator knowing where you are. They know what particular environment you bought that particular if it's a lottery ticket in. They know where you are. And so we've done some interesting things where we've used this data and used, if you like, that geographical data to look at things like gambling in places that sell alcohol versus those that don't sell alcohol, or looking at places that have large numbers of machines versus that have small numbers of machines. And so again, by using this geolocation data, this can have massive consequences in terms of educating not just the researchers in the industry about what players actually do in those situations when they encounter things like alcohol, or they encounter situations where there's lots of other people gambling. These are also very useful for legislators, regulators, and policymakers. So I don't want to leave you with the idea that behavioural tracking data is the be-all and end-all. Very quickly before my conclusions, I'd just like to say that we know, when we think about the behavioural tracking data research that we do, you have to bear in mind that this always comes from what we call an unrepresentative sample. It's only from players who are using that particular online gambling site. This data tells us nothing about the gamblers' overall gambling. So they might be gambling on your site, but also gambling on other sites as well. It doesn't account for the fact, and there are, a small minority of cases where more than one person might be actually gambling on the same account. There is also the situation that obviously these data tell us nothing about why people gamble. We have to infer people's thinking processes from behavioral tracking data. And you can't use behavioral tracking data to compare online and offline, because you've only got the online data there. And obviously these kind of data, they're less likely to provide any kind of insight into the relationships between gambling and other comorbid behaviors. So things like drinking alcohol, taking illicit drugs, for instance. And we can't at the moment use the current problem gambling criteria using behavioral tracking data. Although myself and Michael Auer, we've started to develop other metrics and parameters where we think the industry may be able to do that without actually using a problem gambling screen. So my conclusions is that academics working with the gambling industry, like myself, we don't get an easy ride. We get attacked by other academics and other organizations. But the point is that I think that happens to any of us that do that in that situation, and we have to learn to live with that. I want to reiterate the kind of edict that if both academics and the industry have the same goal, i.e. to protect players and minimize harm, why shouldn't they work together to actually try and achieve this particular aim? As I've said before, the gambling industry, to me, they have the best and the most high quality data concerning gamblers and their behavior. I think technological innovation quite clearly has moved the field forward in terms of responsible gambling considerably, particularly over the last 5 years, due to the nature of these real world studies where we're studying real gamblers in real time on real gambling sites. And I personally, I've been publishing papers for many, many years in gambling, as I say, well over 3 decades now. All academics in universities, we have to get our papers rated by external reviewers. And as a result of that, I can tell you now is that all of my papers that have used gambling industry data tend to be rated far higher than the other types of gambling studies that I do. And I will leave it there and say thank you very much for listening. And I hope that the next time that I'm speaking to you, it will be face to face.